Some stories don't just entertain, they change the way you feel, think, and see life. Welcome to ZZ Stories.
You're coming with me. 4 simple words that would change 3 lives forever. A single construction worker haunted by loss discovers twin girls surviving alone at his daily bus stop. What he doesn't know, these aren't just any homeless children. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The October morning air cut through Thomas Mitchell's jacket like ice through glass. He stood frozen at the bus stop on Maple Street, watching something that made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in 3 years. 2 small figures huddled together on the metal bench, sharing what appeared to be a single threadbare jacket. Twin girls, no more than 8 years old, with tangled golden hair that caught the early morning light like copper wire. Their clothes hung loose on their tiny frames, clearly outgrown, and their shoes had holes that let in the bitter cold. But it was their eyes that stopped Thomas dead in his tracks. Large, expressive brown eyes that held a weariness no child should ever know. They weren't playing some elaborate game of pretend. These children were surviving. The smaller girl, her face flushed with fever, coughed violently into her hands while her sister rubbed her back with the practiced care of someone who had done this many times before. The protective twin whispered something urgent, glancing nervously at the approaching adults with the wariness of prey animals. Thomas felt something stir deep in his chest, something he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. A protective instinct, an ache that had nothing to do with his old construction injury and everything to do with the sight of these 2 children facing the world alone. The number 42 bus rumbled to a stop, its brakes hissing like a mechanical sigh. Thomas had ridden this exact bus from this exact spot every single morning for 3 years. Always the same seat, 3rd row from the front, right side. Always the same destination, Henderson Construction on the east side of Cleveland. But today, as other passengers filed past him onto the bus, Thomas couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the cracked sidewalk. His eyes locked on the twins who remained on the bench, watching the world go by with the infinite patience of those who had nowhere else to be. The bus driver, a heavy-side man named Carl, who'd grown accustomed to Thomas's predictable routine, leaned out the door. "You coming, Mitchell? We're running behind schedule." Thomas blinked, snapping back to the moment. "Yeah, sorry, Carl. Just give me a second." As he climbed aboard, Thomas cast one more glance back at the girls. The smaller one had stopped coughing, but her breathing looked labored. Her sister held her close, their dark eyes following the bus as it pulled away. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas Mitchell missed his stop. That evening, Thomas sat in his empty apartment, staring at the faded photograph on his nightstand. Rebecca smiled back at him from their wedding day, her radiant joy captured forever in that golden frame. The silence in the 2-bedroom apartment felt heavier than usual, pressing down on him like a physical weight. He'd built this life of careful routine after losing her. Same breakfast, black coffee and toast. Same bus route, same work schedule, same empty evenings staring at the same 4 walls. The routine had become his lifeline, the only thing standing between him and the crushing awareness that he was completely alone. But today, that routine had cracked. Those 2 children at the bus stop had somehow managed to slip through the walls he'd spent 3 years building. Thomas found himself wondering where they'd sleep tonight. Were they still at that bus stop? Did they have anywhere warm to go? The smaller girl had looked so sick, and her sister, barely older herself, was trying so hard to take care of her. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the images. Getting involved would only lead to pain. He'd learned that lesson the hard way when life had taken everything that mattered to him in a single devastating moment. The car accident that claimed Rebecca had also left him with a permanent limp and a settlement check that felt like blood money. He'd used it to pay for this apartment, this carefully constructed life of solitude. It was safer here, predictable. Nothing could hurt him if he didn't let anyone close enough to matter. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time Thomas closed his eyes, he saw those brown eyes filled with premature wisdom, heard the sound of that little girl's labored breathing. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the bus stop 15 minutes early. He told himself it was just coincidence, that he'd simply woken up ahead of his alarm. but his heart was pounding as he rounded the corner onto Maple Street, and he knew he was lying to himself. They were still there. The twins sat in the exact same spot, the sick child now leaning heavily against her sister's shoulder. During the night, someone had left a small pile of items near the bench, a worn blanket, a paper bag that probably contained food, a thermos that steamed in the cold air. Thomas wasn't the only one who'd noticed them.
But as he watched from across the street, pretending to check his phone, Thomas saw something that made his blood run cold. A police cruiser was making its way slowly down Maple Street, the officer inside scanning the sidewalks with practiced eyes. The moment the twins spotted the car, they transformed. The protective sister grabbed what she could carry, helped her sick sibling to her feet, and they melted into the alley between two buildings like smoke. By the time the police car reached the bus stop, there was no trace they'd ever been there, except for the abandoned blanket fluttering in the breeze. Thomas felt his hands clench into fists. These children weren't just homeless. They were running from the system, which meant they'd probably been separated before, and they were terrified it would happen again. When his bus arrived, Thomas boarded mechanically, his mind racing. As they pulled away from the stop, he caught a glimpse of movement in the alley. Two small faces peering out, waiting for the coast to clear. At work that day, Thomas couldn't concentrate. His crew, good men who'd worked with him for years, noticed immediately.
"You all right, Tommy?" asked Jake, the youngest member of their team. "You seem distracted today." "Fine," Thomas muttered, hammering a nail with more force than necessary. "Just tired." But Mike, the crew's veteran who'd known Thomas since before Rebecca died, wasn't buying it. During their lunch break, he pulled Thomas aside. "Something's eating at you, Mike," said Mike, unwrapping his sandwich. "You haven't been this rattled since the early days after the accident." Thomas stared at his untouched lunch. Mike was right. The careful emotional distance he'd maintained for 3 years was cracking, and it scared him. "There are these kids," Thomas found himself saying. "Twin girls, maybe 8 years old. They're living on the streets, Mike. Sleeping at the bus stop." Mike's expression grew serious. "You call social services? They run when they see cops. I think they've been in the system before and got separated. They're terrified. So what are you going to do?" That was the question, wasn't it? What was he going to do? The smart thing would be to stay out of it. Report it anonymously and let someone else handle it. Keep his carefully constructed life intact. But even as he thought it, Thomas knew he couldn't. Those children had somehow managed to crack open something inside him that he'd thought was dead forever. The third morning, Thomas came prepared. He'd stopped at the corner store and bought more coffee than any one person could reasonably drink, along with an assortment of pastries and fruit. He arrived at the bus stop 20 minutes early, his heart hammering against his ribs. The girls were there, but something was wrong. The smaller twin, the one who'd been coughing, was barely conscious. Her sister held her upright on the bench, whispering frantically in her ear, trying to keep her awake. Thomas crossed the street without thinking, his construction worker instincts taking over. This child needed medical attention, and she needed it now. "Hey," he said softly, approaching slowly with his hands visible. "I'm Thomas. I see you girls here every morning." The alert twin looked up at him with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. She was beautiful, Thomas realized. They both were, despite the dirt and exhaustion. There was something familiar about their features, something that tugged at the edge of his memory. "We're not supposed to talk to strangers," she whispered, but her voice carried more desperation than conviction. "I know," Thomas said, crouching down to their level. "But your sister is really sick. She needs help." The conscious girl, he found himself thinking of her as the guardian, looked down at her twin with naked fear. "Hope won't wake up all the way. She keeps getting hot and cold." Thomas felt his chest constrict. Hope. So that was the sick child's name, and this protective little warrior must be Faith. And right now, Hope was running out of time. "Faith," Thomas said gently, testing the name. The girl's eyes widened in surprise that he'd guessed correctly. "I know you're scared, but Hope needs to see a doctor. She has what looks like pneumonia, and without medicine, she could get much worse." Faith's eyes filled with tears. "They'll separate us. The people in uniforms always want to separate us." "Where are your parents, sweetheart?" "Mama got taken away." Faith's voice broke on the words. "The bad men said we had to go to different homes. But we ran. We promised Mama we'd stay together. Always together. Thomas felt something crack open inside his chest. These children had been through hell, and they only had each other. The thought of them being split up by a system that didn't understand their bond made him feel physically sick. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "I'm not going to let anyone separate you, but Hope needs medicine, and you both need somewhere safe and warm." He pulled out his wallet, showing Faith his driver's license and work ID. "My name is Thomas Mitchell. I live at 412 Oak Avenue, apartment 3B. I work for Henderson Construction. You can call them and ask about me if you want." Faith studied his face with the intensity of someone making a life or death decision, because that's exactly what this was. "Why do you want to help us?" she asked. The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. Why did he want to help them? Because looking at these two children, seeing their devotion to each other, their determination to survive together against impossible odds, reminded him of something he'd lost, something Rebecca had always said was his greatest strength, his capacity to love without reservation. "Because," he said simply, "everyone deserves someone who cares about them, and right now, you two need someone to care." Faith looked down at Hope, whose breathing was becoming more labored. Thomas could see the exact moment when survival instinct overrode fear. "Okay," she whispered, "but if you try to separate us—" "I won't," Thomas said firmly. "I promise you, whatever happens, you and Hope stay together." As he carefully lifted Hope into his arms, she weighed almost nothing, a bird with hollow bones. Something caught his eye, a small locket around her neck, tarnished and dented, but unmistakable. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be, but as he looked closer, his heart began to race with a recognition that seemed impossible. It was Rebecca's locket, the one she had years ago, the one that contained their wedding photo, the one she'd given to a homeless woman some time ago. His hands shook as he carried Hope toward the street to flag down a cab, Faith clinging to his jacket with desperate trust. How was this possible? How could this child be wearing his dead wife's jewelry? "Faith," he managed to ask as they waited for a taxi, "where did Hope get that necklace?" "Mama gave it to her. She said it belonged to a lady who was kind to her once. A lady with pretty hair, who gave Mama food when she was hungry and had nowhere to go." The memory hit Thomas like lightning. 8 years ago, Rebecca insisting they give their leftover restaurant meal to a pregnant woman they had encountered near Riverside Park. The woman had been young, scared, clearly fleeing from something. Rebecca had pressed money into her hands, and when the woman had admired Rebecca's locket, her generous wife had impulsively given it to her. "What was your mama's name?" Thomas asked, though his heart already knew the answer. "Catherine Rose." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Catherine Rose. The pregnant woman Rebecca had helped was these girls' mother, which meant Thomas looked down at Hope's feverish face, then at Faith's determined expression, and saw it for the first time. The shape of their eyes, the stubborn set of their chins, the way Hope's hair caught the light. They looked like Rebecca. Not exactly, but enough that it tugged at something deeper than memory. These children weren't just random homeless kids he'd found at a bus stop. They were living, breathing connections to his wife's final act of kindness. As the taxi pulled up and Thomas gently placed Hope in the back seat, Faith sliding in beside her sister with protective vigilance, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years: purpose. At Cleveland General Hospital, Thomas paced the pediatric waiting room while doctors examined Hope. Faith sat curled in an oversized chair, wearing scrubs a kind nurse had found for her after Thomas explained their situation. She hadn't let Hope out of her sight until the medical team had finally, gently insisted. "She'll be okay," Thomas found himself saying, as much to himself as to Faith. "They're giving her antibiotics and fluids. She's going to be fine." Faith nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the door to Hope's room. "You really promise you won't let them separate us?" "I promise," Thomas said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. A social worker named Mrs. Chan arrived within an hour, clipboard in hand and questions in her eyes. Thomas had been expecting this. Children showing up at hospitals without parents or guardians always triggered investigations. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, settling into the chair across from him, "can you walk me through how you came to bring these children here?" Thomas told her the truth about seeing the girls at the bus stop, About Faith's obvious illness? About their fear of being separated? He didn't mention the locket yet. That was a conversation for later, when he'd had time to process what it meant. The girls have been in our system before, Mrs. Chen confirmed. Their mother, Catherine Rose, struggled with addiction. We placed them in separate foster homes 8 months ago, but they ran away within a week. They've been surviving on the streets since then. Together, Thomas said firmly. Yes, together. It's unusual. Most siblings adapt to placement eventually, but these two seem to have an exceptional bond. Faith, who had been listening to every word despite pretending to focus on a coloring book, looked up sharply. We promised, Mama. She made us promise to take care of each other.
Mrs. Chen's expression softened. I understand, Faith, but you're both children. You shouldn't have to live on the streets. Better than being separated, Faith replied, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd thought this through completely. Thomas felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. These children had chosen each other over safety, over comfort, over every basic need. They'd survived 8 months on the streets because their bond mattered more than anything. What would it take, Thomas heard himself saying, for me to become their guardian? Both Faith and Mrs. Chen stared at him. Thomas was a little surprised himself. He hadn't planned to say it, but now that the words were out, he knew they were right. Mr. Mitchell, said Mrs. Chen carefully, guardianship is a serious commitment. These children have been through trauma. They'll need stability, therapy, patience. They need someone who won't separate them, Thomas interrupted. Someone who understands that their bond with each other is the most important thing in their world. He looked at Faith, who was watching him with barely concealed hope. They need someone who believes that love isn't something you stumble into by accident, but something you choose to build, day by day, even when it's hard. Mrs. Chen studied him for a long moment. You're single, Mr. Mitchell? Widowed, 3 years ago. The words still felt like glass in his throat, but they came easier than they used to. Any experience with children? Thomas almost laughed. None whatsoever. But I'm a construction foreman. I know how to build things that last. I know how to follow blueprints and solve problems and work with my hands. He paused, looking at Faith again. And I know what it feels like to lose the most important person in your world. I wouldn't wish that feeling on anyone, especially not these girls. Faith stood up suddenly, walked over to Thomas, and climbed into his lap. She was so small, so light, but when she wrapped her arms around him, Thomas felt like he was holding the entire world. Hope likes you, she whispered in his ear. She told me in the ambulance when she was still kind of awake. She said you have safe hands. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. Safe hands? When was the last time anyone had described him as safe? What about you, Faith? He asked gently. What do you think? Faith pulled back to look at him seriously. I think maybe Mama was right about angels. She always said the lady with the pretty hair was an angel who helped us when we needed it most. And now here you are.
The process of becoming the girl's legal guardian was complex and overwhelming, but Thomas approached it with the same methodical determination he brought to construction projects. Background checks, home studies, references from employers and neighbors, psychological evaluations, parenting classes. He tackled each requirement with single-minded focus. Hope recovered from her pneumonia within a week, though she remained quiet and watchful in a way that broke Thomas's heart. The sisters had been placed in temporary foster care during the legal proceedings, but Thomas visited them every day after work, slowly building their trust. During one of these visits, as Hope colored at the kitchen table and Faith helped him review guardianship paperwork, Thomas finally asked the question that had been haunting him. Faith, you said your mama talked about the lady who gave her the locket. Faith nodded, not looking up from the paper she was organizing with remarkable precision for an 8-year-old. Mama said she was the most beautiful person she'd ever seen. Inside and out beautiful, she said, and she had a husband who was just as kind. Thomas's throat tightened. Did your mama ever mention their names? She tried to remember, but she was scared that day and hungry and pregnant with us. She said she wished she could find them again to say thank you. Faith looked up at him with those 2 wise eyes. She said acts of kindness like that don't just disappear. They come back somehow when you need them most. Thomas excused himself and walked to the bathroom where he gripped the sink and tried to process what he was hearing. Catherine Rose was carrying twins when Rebecca helped her, which meant Faith and Hope were... He pulled out his phone and called his lawyer. Jim, I need you to look into something for me. The biological parents of the children I'm trying to adopt. Specifically, I need to know about their father. 2 days later, Jim called back with information that made Thomas sit down hard in his office. Catherine Rose listed the father as unknown on the birth certificate, but I did some digging. Hospital records from when she was pregnant show she mentioned the name David to a social worker. And Thomas, there's something else. Catherine Rose isn't her real name. It's the name she took when she fled an abusive relationship. Her real name was Katie Wells. And get this, she had a boyfriend who died in military service overseas about 8 years ago. Name of David Mitchell. The room seemed to spin around Thomas. Katie Wells, David Mitchell. Rebecca had helped a woman who was running from abuse, a woman who was carrying her dead brother-in-law's children, which meant Faith and Hope weren't just connected to him through Rebecca's kindness. They were his family, his brothers, daughters, his nieces. David had been 3 years younger than Thomas, and they'd lost touch after high school when David enlisted and Thomas went into construction. Thomas knew his brother had died in Afghanistan, but he'd never known David had gotten anyone pregnant before deploying. The pieces clicked together with startling clarity. She'd fled while pregnant, terrified and alone, living on the streets when Rebecca found. Rebecca's kindness had kept Katie and her unborn children alive just long enough for them to be born safely. And now, 8 years later, those children had found their way back to family in the most impossible way imaginable. Thomas didn't tell the girls immediately. The revelation was too big, too overwhelming, and they'd already been through so much upheaval. Instead, he focused on the day-to-day work of becoming the guardian they needed. When the court finally approved his petition, Thomas drove to the foster home with hands that shook on the steering wheel. Faith and Hope were waiting on the front porch with their few belongings in grocery bags, and the sight of their hopeful faces nearly undid him completely. "You ready to come home?" he asked, and watched their faces transform with joy. The apartment felt different, with children in it. Thomas had spent weeks transforming his storage room into a bedroom, hanging pink curtains and assembling twin beds with the help of his construction crew. Faith and Hope moved through the space with careful wonder, touching things gently as if they might disappear. "Is this ours?" Hope asked, speaking directly to Thomas for the first time since the hospital. "This is yours, for as long as you want it."
That first night, Thomas made spaghetti, the only dinner he was confident he couldn't completely ruin, and they ate together at his small kitchen table. Faith helped Hope cut her noodles, and Thomas found himself memorizing every detail, the way they shared bites from each other's plates, the way Faith made sure Hope got the meatballs she wanted, the way they both watched him with cautious gratitude. After dinner, as Thomas helped them get ready for bed in their new room, Hope suddenly spoke up. "Thomas?" Her voice was small but determined. "Are you going to keep us? Forever and ever?" Thomas knelt down between their beds, looking at both girls seriously. "Yes," he said. "Forever and ever. You're my family now." "What if you change your mind?" Faith asked. "What if we're too much trouble?" Thomas thought about all the ways he could answer that question. He could talk about legal commitments or moral obligations. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out Rebecca's locket, the one Hope had been wearing when he found them. "Hope, can I show you something?" She nodded, and Thomas gently opened the locket to reveal the tiny wedding photo inside. Rebecca's radiant smile looked back at them, captured forever next to Thomas's younger, happier face. "This was my wife," Thomas said softly. "Her name was Rebecca. She died 3 years ago in a car accident." Both girls stared at the photograph with wide eyes. "She's the lady who helped our mama," Faith whispered. "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "And there's something else you need to know. Something about your daddy." Very gently, speaking slowly so they could process each piece of information, Thomas told them about David, about the brother he'd lost, about the connection they all shared, about how Rebecca's single act of kindness had brought family back together across time and tragedy. Faith listened with the intensity of someone much older, asking careful questions and making sure Hope understood each part of the story. When Thomas finished, both girls were quiet for a long moment. Finally, Hope spoke up. "Thomas, so you're not just keeping us because you feel sorry for us?" "No, sweetheart. I'm keeping you because you're my brother's daughters, and that makes you my family. But even if you weren't related to me at all, I'd still keep, because the moment I saw you two taking care of choosing each other over everything else in the world, I knew you were the bravest people I'd ever met, and I wanted to be brave like you." Faith climbed out of her bed and wrapped her arms around Thomas's neck. "We want to stay," she said firmly. Forever and ever. Hope joined the hug, and Thomas felt something inside his chest that had been broken for 3 years finally start to heal.
Learning to be a father to 2 traumatized 8-year-old girls was like learning to build with completely unfamiliar materials. Thomas approached it the same way he approached construction projects, one step at a time, asking for help when he needed it, and focusing on creating something stable and lasting. There were challenges. Faith had nightmares about being separated from Hope. Hope struggled with anxiety around authority figures. Both girls hoarded food in their room until Thomas patiently explained that there would always be enough, that they never had to go hungry again. But there were also moments of pure joy that took Thomas's breath away. The first time Hope laughed, really laughed with her whole body at something silly he'd done while making pancakes. The morning Faith called him Dad, without thinking about it, then blushed and asked if that was okay. The way they both curled up next to him on the couch for movie nights, trusting him completely with their safety. Thomas's coworkers at Henderson Construction became unofficial uncles to the girl, teaching them card games during lunch breaks and bringing them small gifts. Mrs. Patterson from the corner store started keeping extra cookies behind the counter for them. The whole neighborhood seemed invested in their success as a newly formed family. 6 months after the adoption was finalized, Thomas stood at the same bus stop where he'd first seen the girls. But this time, he wasn't alone. Faith and Hope flanked him, backpacks secured, lunchboxes in hand, chattering about their upcoming school day. Hope had joined the art club and discovered a talent for painting. Faith had become the best reader in her class and was already talking about becoming a teacher someday. Both girls were thriving in ways that made Thomas's chest tight with pride. Thomas's coworkers at Henderson Construction became unofficial uncles to the girls, teaching them card games during lunch breaks and bringing them small gifts. Mrs. Patterson from the corner store started keeping extra cookies behind the counter for them. The whole neighborhood seemed invested in their success as a newly formed family. 6 months after the adoption was finalized, Thomas stood at the same bus stop where he'd first seen the girls. But this time, he wasn't alone. Faith and Hope flanked him, backpacks secured, lunchboxes in hand, chattering about their upcoming school day. Hope had joined the art club and discovered a talent for painting. Faith had become the best reader in her class and was already talking about becoming a teacher someday. Both girls were thriving in ways that made Thomas's chest tight with pride. Thomas's coworkers at Henderson Construction became unofficial uncles to the girls, teaching them card games during lunch breaks and bringing them small gifts. Mrs. Patterson from the corner store started keeping extra cookies behind the counter for them. The whole neighborhood seemed invested in their success as a newly formed family. 6 months after the adoption was finalized, Thomas stood at the same bus stop where he'd first seen the girls. But this time, he wasn't alone. Faith and Hope flanked him, backpacks secured, lunchboxes in hand, chattering about their upcoming school day. Hope had joined the art club and discovered a talent for painting. Faith had become the best reader in her class and was already talking about becoming a teacher someday. Both girls were thriving in ways that made Thomas's chest tight with pride. As the number 42 bus approached, Thomas caught his reflection in its windshield. The man looking back at him was different from the man who had ridden this bus in solitude for 3 years. This man's eyes held light again. This man had purpose beyond his own survival. "Dad," Hope said, tugging on his jacket, "are you okay? You look sad." Thomas smiled, ruffling her hair. "Not sad, sweetheart. Just thinking about how lucky we are to have found each other." "Mama always said luck was just love wearing a disguise," Faith added solemnly. As they boarded the bus, Thomas felt Rebecca's presence as strongly as if she were sitting beside them. He understood now that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, finds new channels, creates new connections. Rebecca's kindness to a frightened pregnant woman had returned to him in the form of 2 little girls who needed a father as much as he'd needed them. The bus pulled away from Maple Street, and Thomas watched the familiar neighborhood scroll past the window. Faith and Hope discussed their plans for the day, their voices bright with the confidence of children who knew they were loved and safe. Thomas had built houses for other families his entire career, but only now did he understand what it really meant to build a home. It wasn't about walls and foundations. It was about the decision to show up for each other day after day,
even when it was hard. It was about choosing love over fear, connection over safety, hope over resignation. Sometimes the most extraordinary miracles are disguised as ordinary moments. A construction worker seeing two children who needed help, a choice to care more about their pain than his own fear, and the understanding that the family you need might be waiting for you at the most unexpected bus stop of your life. 3 lives forever changed by 4 simple words: "You're coming with me." And they all went home together.